In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So God willing, today we're going to continue. Last week we began the book of 1st Maccabees. Today we're going to continue chapters 2 and 3. Last week we did just chapter 1, and we gave like a background of the book. So just to kind of go overview, like have an overview of what we talked about last week. So this book is a deuterocanonical book, so it's not found in the New King James Bible or in many of the Protestant translations of the Bible. It's found in the Septuagint translation of the Bible, which was a translation into Greek of the original Hebrew, and it's something that has been accepted by the church as a canonical book since the very beginning. This book takes place in between the end of what we consider to be typically the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, which is called the intertestamental period. Okay, and it focuses on what's happening in Israel at that time, and specifically with a family of the Maccabees. Okay, so kind of the background of this book is that as prophesied in the book of Daniel, Israel right now is being occupied by an empire called the Seleucid Empire. Okay, and the king, his name is King Antiochus IV, and he hates the Jews. And unlike the Romans that came later, in the New Testament, the Israel is occupied by the Romans. The Romans gave Israel a lot of freedom to practice their religion however they wanted. They could go to the synagogues, they could, observe the Sabbath, they could circumcise their children, and so on. But before that, the Greek culture, which is what's occupying Israel at this time, this is originally coming from Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquered the whole world, and then when he died, his kingdom was broken up into 4 kingdoms. This was prophesied about in the book of Daniel, and this is what's happening now. So one of these kingdoms, which is the Seleucid Empire, is what's occupying Israel now, and so they're Greek. And Greek culture was essentially like, everybody has to be Greek. Everybody has to do what we do. So they didn't accept the Israelite culture, the Jewish culture, and so they were forcing them to do what it is that they wanted. Okay, so we read in the last chapter that essentially the King Antiochus, is coming, and he's wanting to push his culture on them and push the pagan faith on them. And you see there was a group of Jews that kind of made a deal with him. They said, essentially, we're going to go to the king and we're going to accept what he wants us to do. And he gave them some authority, and they began to convert the nation. They began to build like sports arenas. He forced them to stop circumcising their children. He would kill anyone who was circumcised, and he would kill those who circumcised them. He would prevent them from offering sacrifices. He would prevent them from practicing their faith in any way. And the chapters, it was a long chapter, it was almost 70 verses, spoke in detail about all the ways that they had defiled the altar, they had defiled the temple, they were killing the people, they prevented them from observing the Sabbath, and all of this. And there was a group of people among the Jews, so we broke it down to, there was like 3 groups. Okay, the first group of Jews were the ones that were very much accepting and wanting to convert and wanting to be more Hellenized or Greek, and they were very willing to put aside like their faith and everything because they wanted to be this way. Okay, that was the first group. The second group was essentially the martyrs. They were the group that said, we are not going to change our faith. We're going to continue practicing as we're going to practice, and we're willing to be martyred as a result. Okay. The third group, which both the second and the third we're going to touch on today. The third group was essentially also the ones that were not going to change their faith. They were not going to give in, but they were willing to resist. They were willing to have some kind of a movement where they actually go on the offense. Instead of simply just kind of being more passive and saying, I'm going to, no one is going to change what I believe, change what I do. But in addition to that, I'm going to take some kind of step toward overcoming these Seleucids, overcoming King Antiochus, to kind of be more proactive about it. Okay, and so in this chapter we're going to read about we're going to read about this, more about this family of the Maccabees. Okay, and so the kind of the patriarch of the family, his name was Matthias. Okay, and he had children, and Matthias, he is going to be like the first one to kind of set the line in the sand, essentially saying, we are not going to worship your gods, we are going to continue to observe the Sabbath, we are going to continue to do this, and you're not going to change what we're doing. And then the rest of his family, after his death, the rest of his family, essentially they continue this and they make a revolution. Okay, So in terms of our understanding and like why I feel this book is so important for us is because it shares a lot of characteristics with the modern times that we're in. In our modern society, our society is trying to change us. Our society is trying to tell us that we are ridiculous, that our faith is irrelevant, that it's nonsense, that we shouldn't have this faith. And so there's different ways that we can respond, just like these three groups. Okay, you can have one group, maybe of Christians, that become secular. Say, you know what, you're right. What we're doing doesn't make any sense. God doesn't make any sense. The church doesn't make any sense. Fasting doesn't make any sense. None of this makes any sense. And so we're going to go and just live like secular people. Okay, that's group one. Group two is we're going to continue doing what we're doing faithfully, but we're not going to make any effort to touch or to reach out or to change the society around us. Now, maybe we're not being martyred in the sense of people are coming to attack our churches physically, at least not in the United States, but kind of between the second and the third groups, we ask ourselves, like, what is the balance between the two? Are we just supposed to kind of be faithful in what we're doing and practice it in isolation? Or do we have actually like some offense, quote unquote, that we're supposed to do, not to attack anyone, but to be more proactive in spreading our faith to those people in our culture around us? So keep in mind these three groups, because really the three groups is what defines the response that everybody had in the book among the Hebrew people, and it's like just important to keep it in mind. Okay, so we're going to start at the beginning of chapter 2 today. In those days there rose up Matthias, the son of John, the son of Simeon, a priest of the son of Joarib from Jerusalem, and he settled on the mount of Modin. He had 5 sons, John, who was surnamed Gaddai, and Simon, who was surnamed Thasai, and Judas, who was called Maccabeus, and Eleazar, who was surnamed Avaran, and Jonathan, who was surnamed Aphas. These saw the evils that were done among the people of Judah and in Jerusalem. And Matthias said, Woe to me! For why was I born to see the grief of my people and the grief of the holy city, and to sit there while it is given into the hands of the enemies? So he is observing everything that's happening, and he feels angry, and grieved for what's happening. The holy places have fallen into the hands of outsiders. Her temple is like a man without honor. The vessels of her glory have been taken away captive. Her old men have been butchered in the streets, and her young men have fallen by the sword of the enemies. What nation has not inherited her kingdom and taken from her spoils? All these nations and all the Greeks have been coming and taking everything from the Hebrew nation. All her beauty has been taken away. She who was free has become a slave. And behold, our sanctuary and our beauty and our splendor has been desolated, and the Gentiles have defiled them. Therefore, what is it to us that we still live? This last verse here, verse 13, kind of gives you insight into the mind of this man, Matthias. It's like the reason he lives is for the glory of God. Like the reason he lives is to carry on the commandments that God has given, and he is not satisfied with anything less than this. He's saying, what point is there that we even continue to live if our whole society, if our whole way of life, if our faith is destroyed, and the Gentiles are defiling the temple, and the Gentiles are defiling all this? So his priority was God, to be number one. And Matthias and his sons tore their garments, and they covered themselves with haircloth, and they lamented greatly. And those who had been sent from King Antiochus came to that place to compel those who fled into the city of Modin to immolate. Immolate means to sacrifice, so to offer sacrifice to the idols, and to burn frankincense, and to depart from the law of God. Okay, so the king is coming to the place where they were, essentially offering them that they were going to sacrifice to the idols. And many of the people of Israel consented and came to them. But Matthias and his sons stood firm. And those who had been sent from Antiochus, responding, said to Matthias, You are a ruler and a very splendid and great in this city, and you are adorned with sons and brothers. Therefore approach first, and carry out the order of the king, as all the nations have done, and the men of Judah, and those who remained in Israel. And you and your sons will be among the friends of the king, and enriched with gold and silver and many gifts. Okay, so what's happening now? Who's talking? Who's talking? In verse 17.
People of Israel?
No. In verse 17 it says, and those who had been sent from Antiochus. Okay? So they're coming to who? They're coming to this man Matthias, right? And they're telling him, you are a ruler and very splendid, right? So you're well known. Everybody knows you, like you're a leader among your people, okay? And what are they telling him to do?
Basically, sacrifice to the idols, I think.
Right, sacrifice to the idols, okay? Now, why are they going to him?
Because if he'll do it, other people will follow.
Yeah, so he was very well respected. So if he goes and he offers to the sacrifices to the idols, then other people would follow him and also do the same. Okay? And what is the reward that they're going to get if they do this?
Gold, silver.
Gold, silver, many gifts, become friends of the king, all these things. You're going to have influence and power. You're going to have wealth. You're going to have many gifts, okay? And then one of the things he says here in verse 18, he says, therefore approach first and carry out the order of the king as all the nations have done, and the men of Judah and those who remain in Jerusalem. So what is he saying, essentially?
Everybody have done it.
Everybody's done it. Right? So he's trying to make him feel hopeless. He's trying to make him feel like everybody has done this. Can you think of anyone else who believed that everyone except for him and that he was the last one left who was faithful? From the Old Testament. Elijah was depressed. And he essentially was telling God, I'm the only one who has not bowed the knee to Baal. I'm the only one who has not worshipped idols. I'm the only one. And God responded to him and says, no, there's still all these thousands that have not. Maybe you're not aware of them, okay, but they are there. And so here, like, what the king is trying to do is he's trying to break his spirit. Essentially, he's trying to say there's no point in fighting because everybody else has already given in. And this can happen to us also. Like when we look at the world around us, we feel like it's full of wickedness and evil. And it's easy for us to think, well, there's no hope in righteousness. There's no hope in God. Like how is God going to fix anything when the world is so full of corruption and evil and everything? And this is an attack by the devil. I mean, to make us feel like there's no point in even trying, that we've already lost. But God actually has said that we've already won. Not that we've already lost, but that we've already won. And sometimes it's difficult for us to believe that we've already won, but this is something we have to always be remind ourselves we've already won. Here, Matthias, he has faith in God, and he believes that God can actually expel all of these people. And we're going to see how God actually works. And Matthias responded, and he said with a loud voice, even if all nations obey King Antiochus, so that each one departs from the service of the law of his fathers and consents to his commandments, I and my sons and my brothers will obey the law of our fathers. May God be forgiving to us. It is not useful for us to abandon the law and justices of God. So what is he saying?
He's not going to turn from God.
He's not going to turn from God, even if everybody else turns from God. Who does that sound like?
Like Job? I think he has something like that.
Yes, Job was very faithful even in the midst of his suffering. But who said that even if everybody else were to fall away, that he would not?
Peter.
Peter did say that, but that didn't happen. Somebody else said that, and he actually did it. Saint Athanasius, right? Saint Athanasius in the first council, the first ecumenical council, the Arian heresy was starting to become very well adopted. The Arian heresy essentially was saying that Jesus Christ, the Messiah, he was a creation of God the Father and not God himself. And many people began to believe this, and bishops believed this, and so he essentially said, even if everyone else is going to believe it, I'm not going to believe it. And they told him, the whole world is against you, and he said, what? I am against the world. Like it didn't matter to him the number of people that believed in this wrong doctrine or how many people were, considered him to be their enemy, but he remained faithful despite. So here also Matthias, it doesn't faze him whether everyone believes or doesn't believe. It doesn't matter. God told us to do this, and this is what we're going to do. We will not listen to the words of King Antiochus, nor will we sacrifice, transgressing the commandments of our law, so as to set out on another way. And as he ceased speaking these words, a certain Jew approached in the sight of all to sacrifice to the idols upon the altar in the city of Modin, according to the order of the king. So there was this other Jewish man who was commanded to go and offer for sacrifice, and he's coming up now to offer the sacrifice in front of Matthias. And Matthias saw, and he grieved, and his temperament trembled, and his fury was enkindled according to the judgment of the law, and leaping up, he slaughtered him on the altar. He slaughtered him on the altar. Moreover, the man whom King Antiochus had sent, who compelled them to immolate, he killed at the same time, and he destroyed the altar, and he was zealous for the law, just as Phinehas did to Zimri, the son of Salome. Okay, so what do you think about it? What just happened? This Jewish man came, and what?
He was sacrificing the idols in front of him,
Yes,
and Matthias killed him,
he killed him.
and then he killed the messenger as well.
He killed the messenger, and then he destroyed what?
The altar.
The altar itself. Okay, and then he says what here in verse 24, he says what? According to the judgment of the law. According to the judgment of the law. What do you think about this? About what he did?
He did it out of anger.
So do you think he did it just out of his emotion?
I think he was motivated because it was a wrong,
Mm-hmm.
and he felt truly vindicated, or he truly felt that it was wrong.
Yes. He definitely felt that it was wrong. But do you think that what he did was right?
I don't think so.
No.
No?
I think it wasn't personal.
It wasn't personal.
I felt like he was carrying out God's justice.
Yes, he felt that he was carrying out God's justice. When he says according to the law, and here he's mentioning Phinehas did to Zimri, right? So essentially he's saying there's precedent for this, right? He's saying we're doing according to what has happened before, according to what God wanted before. What is he referring? Who is Phinehas?
He was son of a priest.
Yes.
Eli?
Hmm?
Eli?
No, he didn't. No, this is a different Phinehas. Different one. He came before him. Okay, so we read about this in Numbers 25, verse 11. Okay, this was a time when the Israelites, they were committing sin with the Moabite women. Okay, around them, they were taking these Moabite women as their wives. They were, and this was against the commandment of God. So this man Phinehas, okay, he killed a man named Zimri and the woman that he was with a spear. Okay, God had sent a plague on the people. Okay, as a result of the sin that they were committing. And through the work of Phinehas, by killing this man and killing the woman that he was with, the plague ended. Okay, so we read about this in Numbers 25, verse 11. It says, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest. So, okay, so he is the grandson of Aaron, right? So this happens way before Eli. The grandson of Aaron has turned back my wrath from the children of Israel because he was zealous with my zeal among them, so that I did not consume the children of Israel in my zeal. Therefore say, Behold, I give to him my covenant of peace, and it shall be to him and his descendants after him a covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God and made atonement for the children of Israel. So essentially, God is saying that what Phinehas did was correct, and he rewarded him. And he says, I will reward you even for generations because you have brought peace upon the children of Israel, because you have made atonement for the sin that they have committed. Okay? Keep in mind, in the Old Testament, things are different than today. You know, today we wouldn't see someone committing a sin and go stab him with a spear, and then God would say, yes, this is the right thing to do. Okay? Here, God had commanded that the people obey a certain law. And because they failed to obey this law, God sent this plague upon them. So here Phinehas, on behalf of the entire nation of Israel, it's like he is cleansing the people and he's making atonement for the sin. Okay? And God accepted this atonement and rewarded him. So here, just as then, it's like Matthias is coming to try to cleanse the people by killing the ones that are committing the sin so that God would lift his wrath from the people. Okay? So again, it wasn't a personal thing. Right? It wasn't just he was emotionally angry and acted out of his anger, but he was acting according to the zeal that he had for the law. And Matthias exclaimed with a loud voice in the city, saying, "All who hold zeal for the law, maintaining the covenant, let them follow me." Okay, so this is the beginning now of the movement that is going to happen. Okay, so Matthias is now, when we talk about the three categories, Matthias is in the third category. Like, he was very faithful and he was very loyal, but he wasn't going to just do nothing. He was going to take some kind of action. And he and his sons fled to the mountains, and they left behind whatever they had in the city. Then many who sought judgment and justice went down into the desert. Okay, so there was now two groups. Okay, there was these group of people there in the city of Modin, and they saw all of this happen. A group, it says he and his sons fled to the mountains, so like his family, the Matthias' family, fled to the mountains, and there was another group that went into the desert. Okay, now pay attention here, what's going to happen. And they camped there. This is talking about the group that went into the desert, with their sons and their wives and their herds, because evils had overwhelmed them. And it was reported to the king's men and to the army that was in Jerusalem, in the city of David, that certain men who had cast aside the commandment of the king had departed into the hidden places in the desert, and that many had followed after them. And immediately they went out to them, and they arranged a battle against them on the day of the Sabbath. Okay, what's important about this? It was on the Sabbath. Okay, why did they try to attack them on the Sabbath?
He wouldn't be doing anything.
Because
Like,
they
can't battle or do any work.
can't do any work on the Sabbath. Okay, so this group of Jews, if they're being attacked, okay, on the Sabbath day, on the day they shouldn't do anything, what would be the right response?
Attack back.
But they can't do anything on the Sabbath, right?
Surrender.
So what do you think God would want them to do?
I know so.
Doesn't that break the Sabbath?
It would break it if God had made like the rule that's like not flexible. Like,
So there's flexibility in the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Okay, how is that?
if you understand it right, because God has made it for them to be able to spend time with Him. But if they're being attacked, they wouldn't be able to spend time with Him.
Yes, that's right. So even in the Old Testament, when God gives the command of the Sabbath, what was the purpose of the Sabbath?
Dedicate a day to God.
Dedicate a day to God so you can spend the time with God, not have to work. Dedicate that day for like your spirituality. Dedicate that day to offer sacrifices, to pray, to do those things, right? That was the intention of the Sabbath. Okay. The Pharisees are the ones that really turned the Sabbath into this legalistic thing. Okay, where it was all about, and even today, unfortunately, like people who say, you can only take a certain number of steps and you can't press any buttons, and I don't know who was telling me, like in New York, that on the Sabbath day they have elevators that just go and they stop automatically on every floor because you can't press a button. So you just wait until it eventually gets to your floor and then you get off, right? Like that's not the intention of the Sabbath, right? And it's going to be made very clear here, right? Like if you allow yourselves to be annihilated because people are attacking you on the Sabbath, then you have no opportunity to keep the Sabbath holy because you're dead, right? So we have to understand the Sabbath, and we have to understand the commandments of God. We have to understand the rights of the church. We have to understand all the rules that we have in the right context. The rules are made to enhance God, like man's relationship with God. That's the point of the rules. If we find that the rules are hindering people from approaching God, then maybe those rules need to be reevaluated. Or maybe there's an exceptional situation that in this situation you can't. So for instance, like when we take communion, we're not supposed to have eaten, okay? But what if someone is sick in the hospital and you're going to go give them communion? Are you going to say, well, you couldn't have eaten for 9 hours before I give you communion? No, we break that rule, right? The rule is not something that is like unbreakable because the rule is not as important as God. The rule is not as important as people. People are more important than the rule. But it doesn't mean that everyone just comes and says, maybe for their own selfish purposes, you know what? Well, I want to break the rule. No, the rule can be broken in certain situations. And there are certain people that can decide when it's going to be broken and when it's not. But I can't just say because there was an exception made for this situation that somehow that exception should apply to me, right? So most of us, when we come to take communion, we fast for the 9 hours. But there are people who are sick, or there are people who have whatever condition or whatever that cannot fast. Someone has diabetes, for instance. They might need to eat in the morning. Okay? So they can get absolution from their father, confession that they can eat. So there is no rule. The things that cannot be broken is the dogma of the church. The things that cannot be broken is the essence of the faith. The rules about the fasting, the rules about, a lot of the stuff that we practice those things to enhance our relationship with God. We want to revere, the Eucharist. So we fast before it to make us take it more seriously. But that doesn't mean that rule is overarching and nothing can break it. Okay? So again, the purpose of the Sabbath is to enhance man's relationship with God. And in this case, the Sabbath was not doing that. In this case, the people were using the Sabbath as a weapon against them so they can annihilate them. Okay?
What if somebody asked the question, they said, why is it that Matthias did this, but God didn't tell him that he wanted to do this on his hands? Like, he didn't want to take revenge on his hands necessarily. Did God reveal that to him?
So God speaks in different ways, right? Like sometimes, yes, it's very overt and obvious, and like God comes to him and says, I will choose you to do this. Like many of the judges, for instance, like Gideon or, Samuel, like God appeared to him or spoke to him with an audible voice. But here God is still speaking to him, but in another voice. He's speaking to him maybe with the zeal that he had. And this is why this is more compatible with the way that God speaks to us today. Right? It's like God gives us such a strong zeal about something. Or look at Nehemiah, for instance. Nehemiah, God never spoke to him in an audible voice and told him to do anything. Nehemiah just felt so passionate about how could I leave the walls of Jerusalem destroyed and not take some kind of action. So he felt the zeal, he felt that he had the opportunity, so he made it happen. Right? Same thing here, Matthias. So we should not be under the very minority of times when we should take action is when we actually hear the voice of God audibly. If we all wait around to hear the voice of God audibly, then we will never do anything. Because most likely that's not going to happen. So the number of people that have heard the voice of God audibly telling them to do something is a very, very small minority of people, right? So we can't say that that's the way that God normally acts. That's not the way he normally acts. It's certainly not how he acts today. And even in the Old Testament, there are many places, for instance, like Mordecai and Esther. God never spoke to them in an audible way. Okay? Like I said, Nehemiah. I mean, many people do very good actions that are the will of God, that God is using them, but there doesn't have to be some kind of miraculous appearance or anything like that. Okay, so here they are, they say, and immediately they went out to them, and they arranged a battle against them on the day of the Sabbath. Now remember, this is two groups. Now we're talking about the group in the desert. This is not the group where Matthias and his family is, this is the other group. And they said to them, and now, do you still resist? Go out and act according to the word of King Antiochus, and you will live. And they said, we will not go out, and we will not do the king's word, so as to profane the day of the Sabbath, and they rushed against them in battle. Okay, so essentially this group of people, they said, we will not do anything. We're just going to stay here, okay? And they rushed against them in battle. But they did not respond, nor did they cast a stone at them, nor did they barricade the hidden places, for they said, let us all die in our simplicity, and heaven and earth will testify for us that you destroyed us unjustly. So they carried out a battle on the Sabbath, and they were put to death with their wives and their sons and their cattle, even to the number of 1,000 souls of men. Okay, so this group, they all were sacrificed. They were all killed, okay? And they refused to even defend themselves because it was the Sabbath day, okay? So what do you think about this group?
You can't say they were wrong for not fighting.
Okay.
Because I feel like maybe like Daniel and his 3 friends also didn't break the fast when they could have been in danger. So I think they just felt they were doing the right thing by staying true to the law. They probably didn't understand the law, but they felt that's what, God could save them but they'll put it in God's hand basically by sticking to that day. But they're courageous for doing that.
Yes. So we definitely cannot deny their strong faith for being martyred for this. And you can't blame them and say that they did something wrong. But their conscience told them that this is what they needed to do. Okay? And we're going to read about another group, okay? The other group, we're going to see how they respond. But one thing that I want to emphasize is that this is not about what is right and about what is wrong. But different people respond in different ways because God puts it in their heart to respond that way. For instance, we have people who are martyrs, right, in the church. We look up to the martyrs, you know? Not everyone can be a martyr, okay? Maybe many of us cannot be martyrs, but many of us are going to respond to persecution in different ways. We have people who respond to persecution by making protests and rallies and trying to change laws and making activism and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with that. We can't look at those people and say, well, you're wrong because you're just not accepting martyrdom, right? There is a place for martyrs, and martyrs is like a seed that kind of enlivens and invigorates and gives focus and direction to everyone else. But it doesn't mean that everyone can be a martyr. So here, this group was sacrificing themselves for their faith, and certainly those who came after them, whom we're going to see, saw what they did and decided to take some kind of action. Okay? So there is a place for this. Okay? All I'm trying to say is this is not the only thing. This is not the only way to respond. Okay? And you're going to see the group, the Matthias and his group, are not going to respond this way. Okay? And Matthias and his friends heard of it, and they held a very great lamentation for them. And every man said to his neighbor, if we all do just as our brothers have done, and if we do not fight against the Gentiles for the sake of our lives and our justifications, then they will quickly eradicate us from the earth. Okay, so they identified what was happening. They knew that the Gentiles knew that the Sabbath was a holy day for them, that they couldn't fight or do anything. Okay, and they said essentially, if we do exactly what they did, they're going to annihilate our whole people. Like they looked at it from another perspective. They said, if every Jew kept the Sabbath so strictly, like they did, then our entire nation is going to be wiped out. And again, this was not the intention of God. Not to say that what the second group did was wrong. No, it's not. But neither is what this group did wrong. They saw it in a different perspective, and according to their faith, they acted. Just the second group also, according to their faith, they acted in a different way. So that's to say that sometimes you have many people who are faithful, but they don't agree with one another, and they take different actions, but that doesn't mean that one is right and one is wrong, right? They see things in a different way. For instance, when Barnabas and Paul argued with each other about whether to bring St. Mark with them to the second journey, the second missionary journey, okay, what happened? They disagreed. They disagreed, and they disagreed so strongly that they didn't even travel with each other. They went their own way, okay? Both of them were faithful. Both of them had different opinions. Both of them felt differently about taking Mark with them because he had previously left them when he should have remained with them. But that's okay. Like, God used that situation somehow. Here, you have different groups that respond in different ways, both out of faith, and God used that in different ways, okay? And they decided on that day, saying, every man who will come against us in warfare on the day of the Sabbath, we will fight against him. And we will not die like our brothers who were put to death in the hidden places. Like exactly the opposite. They said, we saw what they did. We saw how they're using the Sabbath against us. So if they come again against us on the Sabbath, we will fight them. We're not going to just allow ourselves to die. And this was not an act of weakness, but it was an act of faith, because they were doing this to preserve the people of God. They weren't doing this for selfish reasons. Then there was assembled before them the synagogue of the Hasidians, strong men from Israel, each one with a will for the law. Okay, so this group, the Hasidians group, this was another group of Jews that held the law very strictly. And some people say that the Pharisees that came a couple hundred years after this were like their origins was this Hasidians. Okay, some people say that the Hasidians are like the beginning of the formation of what later would become the Pharisees. Okay, and it's interesting to note that this group, the one that held the law very strictly, was among those that was willing to break the Sabbath. Okay, to fight. And all those who fled from the evils added themselves to them, and they became a firmament to them. So you notice at the beginning when King Antiochus' men were trying to convince Matthias that everyone has converted, there is nobody who stands against us, and yet here we find there are more and more people that are joining Matthias' group, because they are a resistance group, and they're becoming stronger and stronger. And they gathered together an army, and they struck down the sinners in their wrath, and the wicked men in their indignation, and the others fled to the nations so as to escape. So there were some that joined, and some escaped to other countries. And Matthias and his friends traveled around, and they destroyed the altars, and they circumcised all the uncircumcised boys. Remember, one of the things that King Antiochus did is he prevented the children from being circumcised. And anyone who was circumcised, he killed them. Okay, so they went around actually facilitating the law of God by circumcising these boys, whom they found within the limits of Israel. And they acted with fortitude. And they pursued the sons of arrogance, and the work was prosperous in their hands. And they obtained the law from the hands of the Gentiles, and from the hands of the kings, and they did not surrender the horn to the sinner. Okay? What does it mean, and they obtained the law from the hands of the Gentiles, and from the hands of the kings?
They disobeyed. The king and the Gentiles being the rulers and always that put the law that everybody follows, they returned that to God again and had God, like the law of God be by law.
Yeah, so it's like they saved the law. It's like they prevented the destruction of the law, okay, by the Gentiles. Okay, good. Then the days drew near when Matthias would die, and he said to his sons, "Now arrogance and chastisement have been strengthened, and it is time of overturning and of the wrath of indignation. Now therefore, O sons, be imitators of the law, and give your lives for the sake of the covenant of your fathers, and call to mind the works of the fathers which they have done in their generations, and you will receive great glory and an eternal name." Okay, so essentially he's saying, well, remember how God has worked in the past, right? Be imitators of the law and give your lives for the sake of the covenant of your fathers, and call to mind the works of the fathers. Like, look in the past how God has worked with our fathers, and that God will continue to work this way again. And this is again important for us, because sometimes when we're going through some difficulty, it's easy for us to forget the works that God has done in the past, either to us or to others, and we begin to feel maybe like we're on our own. Here he's saying, remember, look at all the times that God has saved the nation of Israel. Look at all the times that God has expelled the enemies of Israel. And he's telling the people, keep this in your mind. Don't feel hopeless or helpless that you are doing this alone, but God is the one that will prosper you in everything that you do. Was not Abraham, so he's going to go through some names now. Was not Abraham found to be faithful in temptation, and so it was accounted to him as justice? Right? Abraham was faithful in the midst of temptation. Right? He continued to have faith even when God told him, "What? Go sacrifice your son." He had faith and believed that, and God rescued him from this. Okay? Joseph, in the time of his anguish, kept the commandment, and he was made ruler of Egypt. Look how Joseph remained faithful to God for many years, even while imprisoned and in anguish, but he continued to keep the commandment, and he eventually was elevated to be ruler of all of the land of Egypt. Phinehas, the same Phinehas we spoke about earlier. Okay, our father, being zealous in the zeal of God, received the covenant of an eternal priesthood. God rewarded him and says, your priesthood will last forever. Okay, because you ended this plague upon your people by killing those people who were breaking the commandment of God. Jesus, this is a different Jesus. Jesus, since he fulfilled the word, was made a commander in Israel. Caleb, since he testified in the assembly, received an inheritance. Right? Caleb was one of the 2 spies that went to the promised land, and he spied out the land, and he came back and he testified and said, this is a good land. We should go and take this land. Even though it had giants and other scary people in it, and there were wars and battles, and the Israelites felt like, no, they couldn't go in because they were too afraid. But Caleb gave this right testimony. He testified in the assembly, okay, and received an inheritance. These are all the people that Matthias is praising, and he's telling them to remember their work.
Is Jesus just another name for Joshua? Or is it someone we don't know?
It could be, because it says, and was made a commander in Israel. So it's possible that, yes, actually that could be very much what it is. Probably, actually, yeah.
You know, it's Yeshua or
It's the same name.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same name. David, in his mercy, obtained a throne of kingdom for all generations. Okay, what did David have mercy in?
Not killing Saul.
Not killing Saul. When he had the opportunity to kill Saul, he could have killed him, but he chose not to. And because of this, he was rewarded by God as being the kingdom, throne of kingdom for all generations. Elijah, since he was zealous with a zeal for the law, was received into heaven. What did Elijah do? How was Elijah zealous for the law?
The temple, or when he went to war, or he battled the Baal, the god, the prophets of Baal.
Yeah, how did he battle them?
He had like a bet basically between them to see who was the correct or the god, his god or their gods, and they had to sacrifice. And he got 450, I think, prophets of Baal versus him, and whichever altar fire came out of was the right god.
Yeah, so he let them offer a sacrifice on their altar, and he offered sacrifice on his altar. Fire came down from heaven on his altar and not the others. Essentially, he is like standing up and saying, no, only my God is a real God, and your God is not real. Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael, by believing, were delivered from the flame. Against they believed, they refused to bow down to the image that Nebuchadnezzar had put, and as a result, they were thrown in the fiery furnace, okay, and God delivered them. Daniel, in his simplicity, was delivered from the mouth of the lions. Again, same idea, okay? So it's important to have a good understanding of the Bible so we can support our spiritual struggles. When we remember these people and we remember how God worked with them, we can feel more confident that God will work with us in the same way, okay? And so, consider that through generation after generation, of all those who trusted in him, none have failed in strength. And fear not the words of a sinful man, for his glory is dung and worms. Today he is extolled, and tomorrow he will not be found, because he has returned to his earth, and his thinking has perished. What does that mean? Buried? Yeah, so today he is what? Today he is honored, today he's exalted, today he is the king, today he is powerful, but tomorrow he will not be found. Tomorrow he's going to be dead, right? And he will have perished, he will have died, and there is not going to be any memory of him because he lived his life in wickedness. Therefore, you sons, be strengthened and act manfully in the law, for by it you shall become glorious. And behold, I know that your brother Simon is a man of counsel. Heed him always, and he will be a father to you. And Judas Maccabeus, who has been strong and resourceful from his youth, let him be the leader of your militia, and he will manage the war of the people. So he's saying again, because he's about to die, so he's assigning who's going to be responsible for what. Okay, Simon, okay, is going to become like the father of everyone, but Judas is going to become the leader, the military leader, and he's going to have a big role to play in the rest of this book because most of the military victories that they're going to have is going to be under his command. And you shall add to yourselves all who observe the law, and you shall claim the vindication of your people. So gather more people, everyone who still holds the law, gather them to you so that you will have a larger army. Render to the Gentiles their retribution, and pay attention to the precepts of the law. And he blessed them, and he was added to his fathers, meaning he died. And he passed away in the 146th year, and he was buried by his sons in the sepulchres of his fathers in Modin, and all Israel mourned for him with a great mourning. Okay. Any questions about this chapter before we go on? Okay, chapter 3. And his son Judas, who was called Maccabeus, rose up in his place, and all his brothers assisted him, along with all those who had joined themselves to his father. And they fought the battle of Israel with rejoicing. And he expanded the glory of his people, and he clothed himself with a breastplate like a giant. And he surrounded himself his weapons of war in battles, and he protected the camp with his sword. In his actions he became like a lion, and like a young lion roaring in the hunt, he pursued the wicked and tracked them down. And those who disturbed his people he burned with fire. And his enemies were repelled by the fear of him, and all the workers of iniquity were troubled. And salvation was well directed in his hand. And he provoked many kings, and he gave joy to Jacob by his works, and his memory will be a blessing for all generations. What does it mean he gave joy to Jacob?
Like he completed the glorious things that he did as his grandfather or ancestor.
Who is Jacob?
Jacob, father Jacob.
Israel, right? Remember, Israel's original name is Jacob, and he changed his name to Israel. So Jacob is another name for Israel, like the nation. He's like going to give joy to the nation of Israel by his works. And he traveled through the cities of Judah, and he destroyed the impious out of them, and he turned wrath away from Israel. And he was renowned even to the utmost part of the earth, and he gathered together those who were perishing. And so Apollonius gathered together the Gentiles with a numerous and great army from Samaria to make war against Israel. So Apollonius was like one of the members of the Seleucid Empire. And so after, they were warring at them kind of at a low level originally because they were so easy to subdue them. There wasn't really a lot of resistance against them. And now all of a sudden there's this resistance. So King Antiochus is about to ramp up. Okay, he's about to ramp up the war that they're going to mount against them. They're going to make a counterattack. And Judas knew about it, and he went forth to meet him, and he struck him and killed him. And many fell down wounded, and the rest fled away. And he took away their spoils. And Judas took possession of the sword of Apollonius, and he fought with it during all his days. And Saran, the leader of the army of Syria, heard that Judas had gathered together a company of the faithful, an assembly with him. And he said, I will make a name for myself, and I will be glorified in the kingdom, and I will defeat Judas in warfare, and those who are with him who have spurned the word of the king. So Syria now, okay, this king of Syria, his name was what? Or not the king, the leader of the army of Syria, he now wants to make a name for himself and to go and battle against Judas and against this resistance movement, kind of for his own glory. Okay? And he prepared himself. And the camp of the impious went up with him with strong auxiliaries so as to act with vengeance upon the sons of Israel. And they approached even as far as Beth Horon, and Judas went forth to meet him with a few men. But when they saw the army coming to meet them, they said to Judas, How will we few be able to fight against so great and so strong a multitude, even though we are weakened by fasting today? And Judas said, It is easy for many to be enclosed in the hands of a few, for there is no difference in the sight of God of heaven to liberate by means of many or by means of few. For victory in warfare is not in the multitude of the army, but in the strength from heaven. This is very powerful statement here that Judas is saying. People from his army looked at the magnitude of the army that were fighting against them, and they saw that they were a huge number. And essentially he's saying, well, how can we defeat them? Okay, and so Judas is answering, and he's saying what? That God can defeat with many or few. This is very similar to what was said by Jonathan, okay, when they were fighting against the Philistines in the book of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel 14, verse 6, he said, Then Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. This was actually during a time in the battle of the Philistines that the Israelites kept losing against the Philistines. And Jonathan on his own said that he himself was going to go and try to make a difference in the battle on his own. And he's saying what? Nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few. It's not about the amount of resources we have. It's about the fact that God is with us. We see that very much like in the example of King David when he killed Goliath. Okay, he had very few resources, he was very weak, and yet he was able to slaughter this giant. They come to us with a contemptuous multitude and with arrogance, in order to destroy us with our wives and our sons, and to despoil us. In truth, we will fight on behalf of our souls and our laws, and the Lord himself will crush them before our face, but as for you, do not fear them. And as soon as he had ceased speaking, he attacked them suddenly, and Saran and his army were crushed in his sight. And he pursued him from the descent of Beth Horon even to the plains, and 800 of their men were cut down, but the rest fled into the land of the Philistines. And the fear and dread of Judas, as well as his brothers, fell upon all the nations around them. And his name reached even to the king, and all the nations told stories of the battles of Judas. But when King Antiochus heard these accounts, he was angry to his very soul, and he sent and gathered together forces from his entire kingdom, a very strong army. And he opened his treasury, and he gave out stipends to the army for a year, and he commanded them to make ready for all things. And he feared lest he not have enough the second time as the first for expenses and gifts, which he had given before with a liberal hand, for his excesses were more than the kings who had been before him. So what is this saying? What did he do? Here, when he says he opened his treasury, and he gave out stipends to the army for a year, and he commanded them to make ready for all things. So what is a stipend? Money. So he essentially gave the army a year's worth of pay and supplies and everything. Okay? And then it says what? He feared lest he not have enough the second time as the first. What does he mean?
For a second year, you might not have enough.
The second time. What is the second time?
That'd be like the third or fourth year.
This is like the second wave, right? Like the first wave was essentially when we read at the beginning, like in chapter 1, okay? And now there's a resistance, and so he's having to kind of send more army, more troops to kind of quell the resistance and take things back over again. So he's saying he doesn't have enough money, okay? He doesn't have enough money. And he was alarmed to his very soul, right, because he didn't have enough money. And he intended to go into Persia and to take tributes from the regions and to gather together much money. What's a tribute?
Kind of like what is owed to a stronger power or empire.
Yeah, it's kind of like a tax, that you pay me this tax or else I'll destroy you. Okay, so whenever these empires spread, they would take over these smaller nations, and the smaller nations would have to pay a tribute to the empire, essentially for protection, not to be destroyed, and so on. So essentially he said, I gave enough money for like 1 year, but now I have to go get more money because we've run out of money. So he's going to go to Persia, and he's going to take tributes from those nations there to get more money. And he left behind Lysias, a nobleman of royal family, to preside over the kingdom from the river Euphrates even to the river of Egypt, and to raise his son Antiochus until he would return. Okay, what does this mean?
So he went to war. He went to war.
Who?
Antioch.
So Antiochus, he was going to go get money. He was going to go get the tributes. And he left behind Lysias to do what?
Raise his son.
Raise his son.
Look after the kingdom until he gets back.
Right. So essentially he was going to continue the war against the Judas, okay? And raise his son, whose also his name is Antiochus, until he returns. And he handed over to him half of the army and the elephants. And he commanded him concerning all that he wanted, and concerning the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem, so that he would send an army against them to crush and to root out the virtue of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem, and to take away the memory of them from that place. And so that he would establish dwelling places for the sons of foreigners in all their parts, and he would distribute their land by lot. And so the king took the remaining part of the army, and he went forth from Antioch, the city of his kingdom, in the 147th year, and he crossed over the river Euphrates, and he traveled through the upper regions. Then Lysias chose Ptolemy, the son of Dorminus, and Nicanor and Gorgias, powerful men from among the king's friends. And he sent them with 40,000 men and 7,000 horsemen to enter into the land of Judah and to destroy it, according to the word of the king. So this is a very big force, sending into Judah now. And so they proceeded with all their power, and they arrived and took a position near Emmaus in the land of the plains. And the merchants of the regions heard of their name, and they took very much silver and gold and servants, and they came into the camp to take the sons of Israel into servitude. And armies from Syria and from the lands of foreigners were added to them. And Judas and his brothers saw that the evils were being multiplied, and that armies had been positioned near their borders, and they knew the words of the king, which ordered the people to be put to death and to be utterly consumed. Okay, so they're coming in now, and the people are afraid about what's going to happen. And they said each one to his neighbor, "Let us relieve the dejection of our people, and let us fight on behalf of our people and our sacred places." And an assembly was gathered together so that they would be prepared for battle, and so that they could pray and ask for mercy and compassion. Okay, so they were praying and asking for God's protection and his mercy in this upcoming battle. Now Jerusalem was not inhabited, but was like a desert. There was no one who entered or exited from among her children. And the sanctuary was trampled upon, and the sons of foreigners were in the stronghold. This place was the habitation of the Gentiles, and delight was taken away from Jacob, and the music of flute and harp ceased in that place. So, showing like essentially the occupation of Israel was like left everything desolate and empty. The sanctuary was trampled upon. The people were not present. Because this place was the habitation of the Gentiles, essentially saying that they had been so occupied by the Gentiles that you wouldn't find like Jews there. And they gathered together and came to Mizpah, opposite Jerusalem, for a place of prayer was in Mizpah in the former Israel. If you remember when you studied the books of 1 Samuel, Mizpah was a place that the Hebrews, they always went to right before a battle with the Philistines. Okay, and they would pray there for like protection in battle and victory over their enemies, over the Philistines, before they would go to battle. So that's why it's saying this place still existed. It was a place of prayer in Mizpah in the former Israel. Like it was used long ago. They're using it now again, asking God to bless them and protect them from their enemies. And they fasted on that day, and they clothed themselves with haircloth, and they placed ashes on their heads, and they tore their garments. Why are they doing this?
Praying.
They're praying, and they're what?
Fasting.
Fasting.
Yes?
Limiting the death of the second group?
No?
You want God to have mercy on them?
They want God to have mercy, so they are
Repenting?
repenting.
Because
Okay.
it sounds pretty much like Nineveh.
Yes, they are repenting. Exactly. And that's what, like, when the people in 1 Samuel will go to Mizpah, that's what they're doing, is they're repenting. They're essentially saying, like, if this is coming upon us because of our own sins, that we are repenting of our sins. Right? We are repenting of our sins. We're putting on sackcloth and ashes on our head and tearing our garments. And then they did what? They laid open the books of the law in which the Gentiles searched for the likeness of their idols. Essentially, they're saying they're wanting to rededicate themselves to the law. And they brought the priestly ornaments and the first fruits and tithes, and they roused the Nazarites who had fulfilled their days. The Nazarites were like the ones who had taken a vow, and now their vows had ended, who had fulfilled their days. Like, in every way, they're trying to what? Like, make themselves right with God, and to fulfill the law of God, to read the word of God, to pray to God, and everything in preparing themselves for this battle. And it says something about, like, when God sends against us such a big trial or such a big challenge, that what it should do is bring us to this point where we are doing all of these things, where we are praying to God, where we are reading the word of God, seeking to fulfill it, seeking to see how is it that I can change and repent and fulfill my vows and offer my fruits to God and my tithes to God. Like, all these are things that we should do, and that God can send upon us such trial in order to get us to be at this point, because sometimes we don't do these things as we should on our own. And we need some kind of a trial like this, where we have the fear in us and we feel the necessity and like of the closeness of God, that we need it. And they cried out with a loud voice toward heaven, saying, "What shall we do with these, and where shall we take them? For your holy things have been trampled and defiled, and your priests have been in mourning and in humiliation. And behold, the nations gather together against us to destroy us. You know what they intend against us. How shall we be able to stand before their face, unless you, O God, assist us?" Then they sounded the trumpets with a loud call. So in every way, they're rousing the people again to God. And after this, Judas appointed commanders over the people, over thousands and over hundreds and over 50s and over 10s. And he said to those who were building houses, or who had betrothed wives, or who were planting vineyards, or were terribly afraid, that they should return, each one to his own house according to the law. Why did he say this? What is he saying?
That they are not ready for war.
These people, yeah, so
He wants them to go back.
these people he's telling them to return. Okay, what are the groups of people? Those who were building houses, who had betrothed wives,
Or planting vineyards.
or planting vineyards, who were afraid, okay, then they should all return. And like you said, like the thing that's in common, what is the thing in common between all these groups?
They're afraid.
They're afraid, they're not fighters, they're distracted. Right? There's something else on their mind. Like if someone is in the middle of building their house, they're thinking about that. Like that's the thing they're distracted of. If they've just gotten married, okay, or betrothed, they're distracted by that. If in their middle of planting a vineyard, or those who are afraid, they're also distracted by that. Like they're not fully into this battle. But then it says what? According to the law. Okay, so this is actually a commandment that God had given in Deuteronomy chapter 20. He said what? Then the officers shall speak to the people saying, what man is there who has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle and another man dedicate it. Lest another man come and take your house, okay, as his own. Also, what man is there who has not planted a vineyard and has not eaten of it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in battle and another man eat of it. Okay? And what man is there who is betrothed to a woman and has not married her? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in the battle, and another man marry her. The officers shall speak further to the people and say, what man is there who is fearful and faint-hearted? Let him go and return to his house, lest the heart of his brethren faint like his heart. Okay, so this is something, even this. And when you think about, if there was ever a time to disobey the commandment of God and to say, you know what, this is, it's not practical to follow, maybe it would be right now. Okay, like they would be thinking to themselves, we need absolutely everybody to go into fight, because again, like we don't want to be destroyed. And so they could have very easily not done this. They could have very easily said, we're not going to send anybody back, we need everybody to fight. Okay, but even this, they did. Even this, they followed it, and they said, no, this is what God has said that we would do, and so we are going to do it even now. So they're really like places, like makes you see how much they've placed their trust in God to win this battle. What other famous time did the people reduce the number of fighters in the war for victory? Gideon. Okay? Gideon, God like whittled the people down from 30-some thousand all the way down to 300. Okay? Because he said, what, those people, like, you know, whoever's afraid, you can go home. Whoever's whatever, you can go home. Whoever drinks water a certain way, you can go home. And then finally they were left with only 300 people. Because God wanted to show them that God is the one who gives the victory and not the numbers of people they had in the war. And so here also, God is saying, what? You don't need those people. If people are, you know, are afraid, or if people, you know, are in the middle of building or whatever, you don't have to fight. And in the end, God is the one who's going to bring victory. So they moved the camp and relocated to the south of Emmaus. And Judas said, gird yourselves and be sons of power, and be ready in the morning, so that you may fight against these nations that have assembled against us, so as to destroy us and our sacred things. For it is better for us to die in battle than to see evils come to our nation and to the sacred places. Nevertheless, as it shall be willed in heaven, so let it be. Okay, so essentially what they're preparing for battle, okay? And it's saying what? It is better for us to die in battle than to see all this evil come upon us. Like we have to do our part to strive and to fight against it, so it doesn't come upon us while we are doing nothing. And at the end it says, whatever God wills, let it be done. So even if we fail, even if we die, whatever, like let God's will be done, but we can't just stand idly and do nothing while this happens to our nation. Okay. Any questions about this chapter?
I have a question from Bill over here. What's the balance between holy expectation that God will work with us in the way He did with others, and knowing that God works with each person differently? I think she's referring to the last chapter at the end.
This verse here?
No, like at the end of the second chapter, like where I think Judas was like referring to all this stories in the scripture, like how do we balance like we're expecting God to deal with us the same way He dealt with them, like
So even with them, like even here actually, when it says what, nevertheless, as it shall be willed in heaven, so let it be. Even when we talk about, like, for instance, one of the people that was mentioned in that list was Daniel's 3 friends. Do you remember what they said to the king before he threw them in the fiery furnace? What did they say?
if God saves us, we will not bow your like if God saves us, we will not bow to your statue, and if God did not save us, we're still not going to bow to your statue.
Right. So they didn't know that God was going to save them or not, right? Like, so all they knew is God told us to do something, and we have faith in God. If it is the will of God that He saves us, then we are saved. If it is the will of God that we are not saved, then we are not saved. But their faith still is in God. So when we say that we have faith in God, we have faith in who God is. We have faith that God can do certain things, but we don't know for sure that He is going to do those things, right? Like, for instance, when we pray for a person who's sick, okay, and we ask God to heal that person, for instance, we don't know if God is going to heal that person or not. But what we should develop in ourselves is that if God chooses not to heal that person, then that is good. Like, if God chooses something, it is good, even if we don't understand why. Like, and it's not easy to do that. Like, that's not easy to get to that point. But we can still have faith in God even when He doesn't do the things that we want, because most of the time He's not going to do the things that we want. A lot of the time, right? So if my faith is kind of hanging on the idea that God is always going to do what I ask Him to do in prayer, then I'm going to be disappointed in Him. But like the attitude that Daniel's 3 friends had, and like the attitude here that Judas and his army have, this says, nevertheless, as it shall be willed in heaven, so let it be. We are doing all that we can. We are preparing. We are offering sacrifices. We are, showing our repentance. We're fasting. We're putting on sackcloth. We're, doing all these things. But in the end, we're doing this so that God's will can be done. So at least in the end, I can say I've done all that I can do. And the reason that things maybe didn't go the way that I wanted is not because of me. It's because God chose that it would not be this way.
And the second group, like even though they followed the commandments, they still they were not saved still.
Right. The second group was just as faithful as this group, and they died. And again, it was the will of God. Like, they became martyrs that became kind of the seed that served to encourage and motivate others. Yeah, it's a good question. Glory be to God forever.